The Baton Rouge Cafe was Sylvia Harris's real pride. A small but cozy place overlooking the main street of the town. It was famous for its aromatic coffee and homemade pastries, the recipes of which Sylvia generously shared with her neighbors. Having invested all her savings, effort, and time in this cafe, Sylvia considered it her second soul. She could easily recognize every scratch on the wooden tables and every creak of the floorboards in the hall. That Tuesday morning started as usual. The cafe opened at 7 sharp, and the first customers arrived. Local retirees, who over the years had become accustomed to starting the day here with a cup of strong espresso and a newspaper. Sylvia was busy behind the counter, filling the shelves with freshly baked muffins and croissants, when Layla appeared in the doorway. The daughter looked just like her mother. The same expressive features, thick hair gathered in a neat bun, and a dark skin tone that seemed to be infused with sunlight. But there was something different between them. Layla always felt that it was difficult to match her mother, with her hard work and self-confidence. So instead of developing the cafe, she preferred to change areas of activity and find herself in something new. "Mom, I'm here to help," Layla announced, waving her hand as if she were going to save the cafe from imminent doom that day. "Layla," Sylvia smiled, just in time as always. "Bring me another tray from the other side. We're especially popular today." Gregory was also working behind the counter. His tall figure moved deftly between the coffee machine and the shelves of pastries, pouring hot beverages and chatting amiably with the customers at the same time. He managed to create the illusion of the real owner of the place, although everyone knew who really owned the cafe. "Layla, good morning," he said with a slight smile, sliding his gaze over her longer than would be customary. "I'm glad you decided to visit us today. Could you fill in for me at the counter for a while?" "Of course, Mr. Harris," Layla replied with a note of irony in her voice, conceding to his request. Their eyes met for a moment, and Layla's gaze flashed with a strange mixture of curiosity and hidden pride. Gregory was several years younger than Sylvia, and many people noticed that. Although there were no obvious problems in their relationship, rumors in the town surfaced from time to time. Some thought that a man who decided to marry an older woman was either madly in love or too calculating. But who would delve into that when there were so many other stories around? When the flow of customers subsided, Layla and Gregory were alone behind the counter. Sylvia went into the back room to check on the flour supply, and Gregory, glancing at his wife as she left, leaned toward Layla. "How do you like working at the cafe?" he asked with a smile that might have seemed friendly, but had more to it than that. "Quite," Layla answered briefly, looking at him sidelong. "I'm not sure I want to do it all the time, though." "Well, you have to learn to be independent," he said, almost in a whisper, his voice low and slightly mocking. "It'll come in handy in the future." Layla felt his words burn, like hot coffee accidentally spilled on her hand. A hidden reticence had always lingered in their conversations, and it was especially palpable now. A certain appealing menace slipped into his tone that was impossible to ignore. When Sylvia returned, Gregory resumed his duties as if nothing had happened between him and Layla. He skillfully maneuvered between the roles of husband, who does not leave indifferent even after 5 years of marriage, and colleague, who can afford a light flirtation. Toward evening, when the cafe became quieter, Layla stayed behind to help her mother close the cash register. Sylvia, fixing her hair and turning to her daughter, said with a slight smile, "You know, I'm glad you decided to work here, if only for a few days. It really helps me to have your help." Layla nodded, not knowing how to respond to that. She had always felt that Sylvia saw her as a project to be improved, not as a person with her own desires and problems. And at times like now, she felt like she was back to being a schoolgirl trying to earn her mother's approval. Sylvia glanced at her watch and, biting her lip thoughtfully, remarked, "I think it's time to close up. I'll go to the store next door for flour, and you make sure everything's in order, okay?" Layla nodded, and Gregory heard the conversation and said, "I'll help you close up, Layla." He said it without pomp, but his voice was unusually soft. It was as if he were doing it for her, not for the cafe, not for Sylvia. Layla felt a slight shiver run down her spine. Her mind told her not to get carried away with this game, but something was pulling her closer to Gregory, his attention, his ability to be there when she needed him. The next day, Sylvia was immersed, as usual, in the business of the cafe. Gregory had gone away for a few hours on his own business, leaving her alone with Layla. On this day, when there were fewer customers, Layla was suddenly more active. She started asking questions about the business, wondering how to choose suppliers, what dishes sold best. Sylvia was surprised to note this change in her daughter's behavior, but wrote it off as temporary interest. However, when Gregory returned and saw them discussing the business of the cafe together, his gaze darkened for a moment. A slight shadow of jealousy flashed in his eyes, not for Sylvia, but for the attention she was receiving from Layla. He was used to being the one who drew her interest, and now, watching Layla listening to her mother's passionate listening and questioning, he felt that his influence might be waning. Business at the Baton Rouge Cafe went on as usual, but tension was beginning to seep into the cozy atmosphere of the place like invisible smoke. Gregory and Layla found themselves alone together more and more often, under any plausible pretext. If they needed to move something to the back room, check the stock, or just clear the tables, Gregory was there to help, as if casually. Layla was getting used to his presence, and sometimes she found herself looking forward to his arrival more than she would like to admit. In a town where everyone knew each other, such things couldn't go unnoticed. Rumors started flying around like summer mosquitoes, quick and annoying. Someone saw Layla and Gregory standing by the car too long after the cafe closed. Someone claimed to have heard their muffled laughter around the corner of the building. Discussing their relationship soon became one of the favorite topics at the local hair salon, where for years Sylvia's neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy, had been gossiping with her friends about the news of the town. "Did you hear that? They say Layla isn't as innocent as she wants to appear," one of the women murmured as her hair was sprayed with a lot of hairspray. Gregory was clearly not her father's figure, but she seemed to enjoy it. Mrs. Dorothy, not wanting to lose her authority among her neighbors, nodded demurely, but she was seething inside. She could not make up her mind whether to tell Sylvia what she heard in town or to keep silent. The next day at the cafe, Gregory and Layla were alone together again when Sylvia went out on business. "Have you noticed that people in town have started talking about us?" Layla asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Gregory, not taking his eyes off the cleaning, only smirked. "Let them talk," he replied calmly. "People will always find something to gossip about. Besides, if we don't do anything, we have nothing to fear, right?" Layla sensed a slight sneer in his words, as if he were implying that what they were doing or thinking of doing was what mattered. She didn't pursue the subject any further, though a feeling of unease continued to grow inside. Meanwhile, Sylvia began to notice oddities. She was checking the monthly bills and receipts, and some of the amounts didn't add up. Particularly suspicious were purchases related to flowers and small gifts that she herself had not seen. These expenses didn't seem huge, but their frequency was unusual. Gregory, when she asked him, always replied that it was for general needs or to maintain good relations with customers and suppliers. One evening, Sylvia decided to ask the question directly. "Gregory, I found some strange receipts," she began, trying to keep her voice calm. "Purchases from flower and gift stores. I don't know anything about them." Gregory didn't even blink. "They're just little things to keep in touch," he answered with absolute certainty. "You know how important it is to do small favors for partners and clients." Sylvia wanted to believe it, but her inner voice insisted that this kind of little things should not become a habit. Her suspicions were growing, but she realized that now was not the time to make a fuss. A few days later, when the cafe was about to close, Layla stayed behind to help clean up. Gregory offered to drive her home, and although she usually preferred to walk, this time she agreed. There was a slight silence in the car, and Layla didn't know how to break it. "Do you really think no one will notice?" she asked suddenly, though she hadn't expected herself to be so blunt. "What should they notice?" he answered, looking at the road in front of him. "We're just helping each other." Her lips quivered in a faint smile. She realized there was more truth in his words than he was willing to admit out loud. After all, Gregory hadn't offered her anything specific, but his actions spoke for themselves. As Layla stepped out of the car, he held her hand for a moment. The look they exchanged in that moment was full of understatement. She quickly pulled her hand out and entered the house, but a sense of guilt and dangerous anticipation had already settled in her heart. Soon, Sylvia received an unexpected call from an old friend who worked at the bank. He mentioned strange transfers to her account, and Sylvia realized that her suspicions were not unfounded. She tried again to strike up a conversation with Gregory. "We need to have a serious talk about our expenses," she began, holding up a printout of bank transactions. "I don't understand why so much money is being spent for unknown purposes." Gregory looked at her with such sincerity that for a moment Sylvia almost retreated. "Darling, you worry too much," he said with a softness in his voice. "I'm just trying to invest in the future, in our future." Sylvia froze, not knowing how to react. It sounded so right that she had to question her fears again. A few days later, Layla received a small box wrapped in expensive paper. Inside were dainty earrings, sparkling like dewdrops in the sun. She knew who the gift was from. She didn't even doubt it. Gregory hadn't said anything directly, but his looks, words, and actions were forming a coherent picture. Layla felt a strange mixture of joy and anxiety for a moment. She realized that such gifts had a price, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to pay it. Gregory had sensed for weeks now that the situation was heating up. The rumors in town were becoming more persistent, and Sylvia, despite his attempts to hush up questions about the expenses, was becoming more cautious and attentive. Layla wasn't staying away either. Although they still hadn't spoken directly about their feelings, her behavior increasingly signaled a mutual attraction. Gregory knew it was time to act before things got out of hand. He decided that Sylvia had to go, forever, and that it had to be done in such a way that no one, not even she herself, would realize that her death was the result of his elaborate plan. After all, she deserved to leave at least honorably, without all the high-profile revelations and scandals. Gregory spent a few days thinking through his options on how to do everything as discreetly as possible. A simple murder wasn't an option. He knew the police would definitely dig deeper if they did, and the likelihood of his connection to Layla coming to light was too great. What was needed was a method that at first glance would look like a fluke. He settled on poison, but not some exotic substance, but something that could easily be disguised as ordinary food poisoning. After much searching and reading articles on the internet, Gregory chose a plant-based toxin that could be spiked into food. It was a perfect fit. The symptoms could be blamed on spoiled food or a viral illness. All he had to do was find a moment when Sylvia would cook on her own. They rarely used ready-made food in their house, and even the cafes always tried to prepare meals with only fresh ingredients. So it was necessary to choose something that Sylvia wouldn't notice, like seasoning. After a few days, Gregory noticed that his plan was beginning to take shape. Sylvia had been complaining of fatigue lately. He reassured her, telling her that it was normal for her age, that she just needed more rest, but really that was exactly what he needed. When the symptoms started, lightheadedness, nausea, Sylvia really didn't pay much attention to them. She thought it was just a consequence of working hard at the cafe and the constant stress. The following week, Gregory was able to act. He and Sylvia were having dinner at home, and he offered to help her prepare a specialty, chicken and gravy from her mother's recipe. While Sylvia retreated to the telephone, he added a carefully measured amount of poison to the sauce, confident that it would be indistinguishable from ordinary spices. When Sylvia returned, he pretended that nothing much had happened. "Darling, I think we've had a particularly good meal today," he remarked as he put a portion on his plate. Sylvia, unsuspecting, accepted the compliment with a smile. A few days later, Sylvia's condition worsened considerably. She was nauseous, constantly dizzy, and sometimes feverish. She refused to go to the hospital, believing it was a waste of time. Just a simple viral infection, she convinced herself, chugging her pills with water. Gregory was careful to keep the symptoms under wraps. He even reminded Sylvia to take her medication himself, like a caring husband, and sometimes helped her walk when she was feeling quite bad. Whenever she thanked him for his help, he pretended to be embarrassed. "I am your husband, my love. Of course I'll be there for you," he replied with a warm smile, though inside he was waiting for it to be over. One evening, when Sylvia was barely on her feet, Layla came to the cafe to help close up the place. Gregory met her at the door, and though he looked fine with everything, there was a look of concern in his eyes. "Mom's not feeling well," he said, putting his arm around Layla's shoulders as if trying to comfort her. I don't know what to do. She doesn't want to go to the doctor." "Maybe I could talk to her," Layla suggested. "You know how stubborn she can be." "You could try," Gregory nodded, "but I don't think she'd even listen to you." Layla tried to persuade her mother to go to the hospital, but Sylvia just waved her hand as if it were one more minor concern in the daily routine. "I'm just a little tired," she whispered. "It will all pass." Gregory, standing back, kept his eyes on Layla. He knew that her attempts to persuade Sylvia would get her nowhere. On the fourth day after dinner, when the symptoms had gotten so bad that Sylvia was almost unable to get out of bed, Gregory decided to strike one last blow. He slipped a small dose of poison into her tea again, knowing that this step would be decisive. Sylvia drank the drink, unaware that she was doing it for the last time. By late afternoon, her condition had become critical. Layla sat by her mother's side, holding her hand and begging her to call an ambulance, but Sylvia stubbornly refused, saying it would pass if she just rested. Her face paled, her breathing becoming more and more labored. Gregory sat in the next room, listening to the life slowly drain from his wife's body. When Sylvia finally passed away, no one suspected anything strange. Layla was overwhelmed with grief, but not before realizing exactly what had happened. The doctor who arrived on the scene wrote her death off as food poisoning, a phenomenon unfortunately not uncommon in an area where the summer heat quickly spoils food. Gregory looked genuinely grief-stricken. He put his arms around Layla, and without releasing her from his embrace, whispered, "I don't know how we're going to get on with our lives." There was no tremor in his voice and no sadness in his eyes, but Layla was too shaken to notice it. The investigation began shortly after Sylvia's funeral. In a small town in Louisiana, death by food poisoning was certainly not unique, but the local coroner, after doing some basic analysis, still decided to report some strange findings to the police. Sylvia's body showed traces of unknown chemical compounds that didn't fit the typical pattern of accidental poisoning. Detectives Raymond Foster and Gina Matthews, a pair of experienced investigators who had worked in tandem for years and knew how to find hidden details in the most convoluted cases, came on the scene. At first glance, the case didn't seem complicated, but both felt there was something odd about the woman's death. The first thing they did was meet Layla at the Baton Rouge Cafe. Gregory insisted that his daughter was grief-stricken and couldn't talk about what had happened at home, so they met at the workplace. Layla sat at a table in the corner, her eyes slightly reddened, but she looked more detached than truly saddened. "Layla, we're sorry for your loss," Detective Foster began, sitting down across from her. "We need to ask you some questions about your mother's condition in her final days." Layla nodded, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin. She looked away from Ray and Gina as if she didn't want to be here. "Mom's been sick for a week," she said quietly. "I tried to get her to see a doctor, but she refused. She said it was just fatigue and it would go away." "Were you with her when she died?" Gina asked, watching Layla's reaction carefully. "Yes," Layla answered, looking at the detective with a strange calmness. "But it happened so fast. I didn't even have time to call an ambulance." Her words sounded sincere, but something was bothering the detectives. Layla didn't look as grief-stricken as they expected. She looked more like someone who had resigned herself to the inevitable than someone who had recently lost her mother. When the detectives went to meet Gregory, he diligently played the role of devoted husband. At the funeral, he stood by the coffin, barely moving away, and continually told everyone how much he loved Sylvia and how she would be missed. There was not a trace of tears in his eyes, but no one would have taken that for anything strange. People express grief in different ways. The detectives decided to meet Gregory at his house. When they went in, he was just sitting in a chair, leafing through old photo albums. The photos were of Sylvia, Layla, and himself, all smiling, enjoying moments of family happiness. "Detectives, come in," he said with a muffled sadness in his voice. "I was just going through some old photos. You know, it's so hard to believe she's gone." "We understand, Gregory," Detective Foster began, taking a seat on the couch across from him. "But we need to talk about your wife's last days. We're told she had some health problems before she died." "Yes, she wasn't feeling well," Gregory confirmed, pausing as if searching for the right words. "She started having some strange symptoms, Nausea, weakness, dizziness. I offered to take her to a doctor, but Sylvia was... He took a deep breath, as if struggling with the pain, was stubborn, said it was just a cold. The detectives looked at each other. That explanation sounded plausible enough, but something in Gregory's demeanor seemed overly rehearsed. He answered too calmly, without confusion, as if he knew that was what he was going to be asked. "Did you notice anything strange about her food or drink? Maybe she'd been using something unusual in the last few days?" Gina continued. "No, nothing special," Gregory shrugged. "We ate the usual home-cooked food, and even the cafeterias were always careful about the quality of the food. I didn't notice anything strange." Later, discussing the results of the conversation, Ray and Gina concluded that Layla and Gregory's testimony was generally consistent, but left too many questions. In addition, the results of the toxicology analysis indicated the presence of chemicals in Sylvia's body that could not have come about by accident. It was decided to re-examine the kitchen in the house and the cafe to see if any toxins could have gotten there. During the examination, detectives noticed an inconspicuous spice jar on a shelf in the kitchen of the house. There were no special markings on it, and it seemed no different from the others. But just in case, the detectives took it for analysis. It was a small deviation from normal procedures, but Gina, with the flair of experienced detectives, had insisted on it. When the test results came back, they confirmed the speculation. The spice jar contained traces of the same toxin that had been found in Sylvia's system. It was now clear that the poisoning had not been an accident. The question was, who had done it and why? Layla was once again the center of attention, as she had been spending a lot of time with her mother in the last few days. The detectives wanted to find out what she knew about Gregory's strange behavior, and if she suspected anything. Layla acted nervous during the interrogation. Sometimes her answers sounded like she was defending someone rather than just recounting events. "Layla," Detective Foster addressed her, "are you sure you didn't notice anything suspicious about your stepfather's behavior? Was there anything he was doing that you might find odd?" Layla looked away and after a moment's silence replied, "No, I didn't notice anything like what you're talking about. He took care of Mom as best he could. We all did the best we could." "I understand," the detective nodded, "but we still have questions. We know that Sylvia was a stubborn person, but why was she so adamant about refusing medical help? Doesn't that strike you as odd?" Layla frowned. "I think she just didn't want to spend money on doctors. Mom always thought that home treatment was the best medicine, but maybe she was wrong." The detectives noted to themselves that Layla was defending her mother's memory with unexpected coldness, but her words gave them no clear answer. Gregory, meanwhile, acted as if he knew that the attention of the investigation would sooner or later be directed to him. He remained calm and composed, without any emotion that might give him away. When he was asked about the jar of toxin he had found, he merely waved his hands. "They were spices that were rarely used. I didn't know we had them." Soon after the discovery of the toxin in the spice jar, detectives began revisiting the evidence and interviewing witnesses over and over again in an effort to understand exactly how the toxic substance ended up in the house. As they dug deeper into the case, new details surfaced that seemed to pull the most unexpected connections to the surface. One of the first findings that piqued the detectives' interest was the history of search queries on Gregory's computer. He wasn't in the habit of closing all windows and clearing history on his browser, so the detectives soon came across articles about plant toxins and natural ways of disposing of people. Gregory was careful not to be too obvious. He wasn't looking for specific ways to kill, but was interested in food safety, methods of dealing with foodborne bacteria, and similar topics. Nevertheless, it was suspicious enough at the very least. It indicated that Gregory had an idea of how such substances might act on the body. Detective Matthews, scrolling through the list of queries, couldn't resist a sarcastic comment. Well, if he was trying to keep a low profile, he could have at least not searched for top 5 poisons you won't find in the body. Foster grinned, but there was a glint of understanding in his eyes. Gregory was obviously hiding something. The next step was to find out what Gregory had been buying lately. The average person might not remember every little thing bought at the drugstore or supermarket, but something on his shopping list seemed strange. At the drugstore he had visited a few weeks before Sylvia's death, Gregory had bought an insect repellent that contained a specific ingredient that matched the chemical composition of the toxin he had found. The pharmacist who sold the repellent didn't remember much about it, but confirmed that the customer didn't look like a farmer worried about a pest infestation. "He only bought this product and nothing else?" Detective Matthews asked the salesman, glancing over at Foster. "Yes," the pharmacist replied with a shrug. "Took it and a couple other things, like vitamins. Nothing that would be memorable. Looked calm, ordinary." These details didn't prove guilt, but they were one more piece of the puzzle. Now we had to figure out why Gregory needed insect repellent if he wasn't gardening. In the course of interviewing the cafe staff, one of the cooks, an elderly man named Carl, recalled that on the day Sylvia felt particularly ill, Gregory had gone into the kitchen and spent a long time rummaging through the spices. It seemed odd, since he usually stayed out of the kitchen, even if he was helping Sylvia. He said he was looking for something for a new recipe, Carl explained. "I didn't even pay much attention to it. But now that you're asking all this, I'm starting to wonder. I've never seen him pick out spices with such fervor before." When detectives resampled the spices from the cafe, they found that some of the jars contained traces of the same toxin that was in the house. Gregory clearly didn't choose this method by accident. He tried to make it look like an accidental poisoning at work. In parallel with the search for physical evidence, the detectives began to investigate personal connections. The deeper they dug, the more hints of a romantic relationship between Gregory and Layla surfaced. First of all, it was indicated by the numerous rumors in town, which at first seemed like common gossip, but gradually formed into a clearer picture. Gregory and Layla's frequent meetings after the cafe closed were noticed, as well as the small but regular gifts Gregory was buying. Layla, of course, denied that anything had happened between them, but her behavior during the interrogations only added to the suspicions. She seemed to be trying to protect Gregory, even if it didn't always seem logical. "Layla, are you sure you don't know anything about what Gregory was doing in the last days before your mother's death?" Gina Matthews asked. "Yes," she answered, but her voice trembled. "He was just trying to help. We were all trying." The investigation culminated in the discovery of an important piece of evidence. A paid rent bill for an apartment in a neighboring town. Gregory had rented the apartment in the name of a front man, and it was where he'd taken Layla to avoid rumors in his hometown. Detectives had found not only signs of their presence there, but also photographs left on the table, pictures of Layla taken in recent months, and a few snapshots from their walks. The detectives now had indisputable proof that Gregory and Layla were more than just stepfather and stepdaughter. This fact gave them motive. Sylvia's death could have been planned so that Gregory and Layla could be together. The last and most important piece of evidence was the discovery of a note in Gregory's cell phone. He was making notes as if he was making a plan of action. One of the notes explicitly mentioned adding a small amount, and although it didn't explicitly say what exactly it was referring to, investigators concluded that it was referring to adding a toxin to food. All of the information was slowly coming together into a coherent picture, and now detectives were confident that they had enough evidence to make a charge. When the detectives entered the cafe with the arrest warrant, Gregory was sitting behind the counter, lazily flipping through a magazine. He seemed to know they were coming, but hoped it wouldn't be so soon. When he heard footsteps, he raised his head, and his gaze froze for a moment. What might have been mistaken for surprise flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a stony mask. "Gregory Harris, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Sylvia Harris," Detective Foster said, holding up the handcuffs. "There must be some mistake," Gregory began, rising from his chair. His voice trembled, and Foster caught a faint note of panic. "I loved my wife. I would never—" "You don't have to talk," Foster interrupted him, "but every word you say could be used against you in a court of law." As the detectives snapped the handcuffs on Gregory's wrists, he cast a quick glance at Layla, who was standing at the door. Her eyes were wide open, and her face was like a mask that had no room for tears or anger. She stood as if paralyzed and watched as the man she had recently considered close to her was taken away. "Layla," Gregory called out to her as he was led toward the exit. "Tell them it's a mistake. You know what happened?" But Layla didn't answer. She stood with her hands clasped together and remained silent. Only when the door slammed shut behind the detectives did her legs buckle, and she sank into a chair, as if her body could no longer bear the weight of all the unanswered questions. In court, when the prosecutor presented the evidence, every time Layla's name came up, she flinched. The photos found in the apartment, the records on Gregory's cell phone, the toxin in the spices, it all built up into a chain that could no longer be broken. When the prosecutor presented the results of the spice analysis, Gregory made a barely perceptible movement as if he wanted to object, but his lawyer put his hand on his shoulder, signaling that it was better to keep quiet. Then Carl's testimony about Gregory's strange behavior in the kitchen was heard, and Gregory turned pale for the first time. The prosecution alleges that Mr. Harris used the spices as a cover for putting the toxin in his wife's food. We have testimony and forensic evidence to back that up, the prosecutor said. Gregory sat back, trying not to look at Layla. She, in turn, looked straight ahead, her gaze focused, but her eyes seemed empty. At one point, she finally met his gaze. Gregory tried to make some sort of desperate plea, but all he got in response was an icy expression. "Layla?" he whispered. But his voice was drowned out by the clatter of chairs and the rustle of paper. When the verdict was read, Gregory remained upright, though his face had turned white, as if all the blood had been drained from it. Layla no longer looked at him. A few months later, the Baton Rouge Cafe opened its doors to the public again. Layla tried to maintain the atmosphere that her mother appreciated so much. The smell of fresh pastries and coffee, the cozy interior, and the friendliness of the staff. But for her, the place was no longer the same. In every corner of the cafe, she saw memories of Sylvia, her quiet laughter behind the counter, her strict instructions about recipes, and that special look in her eyes when they discussed business. Layla sat at the very table where she'd given her statement to the detectives a few months ago. She stared at the cup of cooled tea she couldn't bring herself to finish. Everything that had happened still reminded her of the irreversibility of loss. The cafe was hers now, but that brought no comfort. For a moment, Layla thought that instead of continuing her mother's business, she would be better off leaving this town and its ghosts behind. But something kept her here, perhaps the guilt that never let go. Even though Gregory had gotten the punishment he deserved, she couldn't help but think that her own reticence and ignorance had played a part in the tragedy. Sometimes, as she closed the cafe in the evenings, she could hear her mother's voice echoing in her head, rebuking her for overlooking the obvious. On one such evening, when Layla was alone again in the empty cafe, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy, approached her. "You're doing well, Layla," she said, taking a seat at the table across from her. "I know a lot of people have said nasty things, but people are always talking. Your mother would be proud of you." "Thank you, Mrs. Dorothy," Layla replied quietly, giving a weak smile. "But I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing." "There are no right answers," the old woman sighed. "But if you feel you're doing something good, then you are. Remember, life goes on." Layla nodded silently and watched Mrs. Dorothy walk away. She realized she had a long way to go to forgive herself and learn to live with the shadow of what had happened. But for now, she had the cafe, she had the memory of her mother, and she had a small but real hope that the wounds would eventually begin to heal. She got up, turned off the light, and locked the door. Outside, dusk was already falling, but somewhere on the horizon a streak of sunset still burned, promising a new day.